In the winter of 1546, something unspeakably foul haunted the corridors of England's royal palaces. Courtiers would catch the smell first. A sickening, sweet stench that seemed to follow King Henry VIII wherever he went. Some whispered it was like rotting meat. Others claimed it smelled like death itself. What they didn't dare say aloud was the horrifying truth. Their king was literally decomposing while still alive. This is the story of one of history's most grotesque royal deaths. A tale of how the most powerful man in England became a walking corpse, his body rotting from the inside out while he continued to rule with an iron fist. Henry VIII hadn't always been a medical nightmare. When he ascended the throne in 1509, he was everything a Renaissance king should be: tall, athletic, handsome, and commanding. At over 6 feet, in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Henry dominated every room he entered. He was a champion jouster, a skilled tennis player, and a fearsome hunter. But the seeds of his horrific end were planted during his prime. The first warning came in 1524, when a jousting lance struck him directly in the face, knocking him unconscious for hours. The blow left him with chronic headaches and may have caused brain damage that would later manifest in his increasingly erratic behavior. The real catastrophe struck 12 years later. On January 24, 1536, during a tournament at Greenwich Palace, disaster struck with sickening force. Henry, now 44 and considerably heavier than in his youth, was thrown from his horse in a spectacular crash. A fully armored warhorse weighing over 1,000 pounds fell directly on top of him, crushing his left leg with devastating force. Witnesses reported that the king lay motionless for 2 hours. Many believed England's monarch was dead. When Henry finally regained consciousness, he discovered that his left leg had been catastrophically damaged, creating a wound that would fester and rot for the remaining 11 years of his life. What started as a jousting injury became something far more sinister. The crash had crushed Henry's left thigh, creating what 16th century physicians called a fistula, essentially a deep infected tunnel through his flesh that would never properly heal. Without antibiotics or modern surgical techniques, the wound became chronically infected. Henry's doctors, following medieval medical theory, believed they had to keep it open and draining to prevent bad humors from building up inside his body. They inserted drainage tubes made of gold and silver, thinking these precious metals would prevent further corruption. Nothing worked. The wound continued to fester, producing what one disgusted courtier described as matter both great in quantity and evil in quality. In plainer terms, pus and rotting flesh poured from the king's leg daily, creating a stench so overwhelming that people in adjacent rooms could smell it. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that can persist for years, literally causing bone tissue to die and rot. The condition produces exactly the kind of persistent, foul-smelling drainage that plagued the king. But the leg wound was only the beginning of Henry's medical horror story. As the years passed, Henry's condition spiraled into something truly monstrous. By the 1540s, he had become massively obese, likely weighing close to 400 pounds. His waist measured over 50 inches, and moving became agonizing. He required mechanical devices to help him mount horses or climb stairs. The obesity worsened his infected leg, making healing impossible. But even more disturbing, Henry developed what courtiers whispered about as his other wound, likely an infected anal fistula or chronic abscess in his groin area. Historical records hint at physicians treating the king for conditions in his most private parts, and servants reported frequently changing linens stained with blood and pus from multiple body locations. Henry VIII had become a walking source of putrefaction. His body was rotting in several places simultaneously while he continued ruling one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The royal household had to develop extraordinary adaptations to function around their decomposing sovereign. The smell was the most immediate challenge. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer privately wrote that approaching the king required great fortitude of spirit and strong constitution of stomach. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths during audiences and carried pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic spices, to mask the stench. Henry's chambers were constantly filled with burning incense and aromatic oils, but nothing could completely overcome the smell of rotting flesh. His personal servants faced nightmarish conditions. They developed systems using multiple layers of absorbent cloth to contain the fluids leaking from his wounds, but nothing worked completely. His bedding required changing multiple times daily, and mattresses had to be regularly replaced when they became too soaked to clean. Dining with the king became an ordeal. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the challenge of maintaining diplomatic composure while fighting waves of nausea during royal banquets, as the smell of infected wounds mixed sickeningly with food aromas. Perhaps most remarkably, the court maintained strict secrecy about Henry's true condition. While rumors circulated, official records preserved the fiction of a healthy monarch. Foreign diplomats received carefully choreographed audiences designed to minimize their exposure to the king's medical horrors. By 1546, Henry's multiple infections were overwhelming his system. The leg wound would periodically close, giving false hope, only to burst open dramatically, releasing floods of infected material that soaked through clothing in minutes. The smell during these episodes was so intense that people fled nearby rooms. Sleep became impossible. Constant pain from his wounds, combined with the discomfort of his massive weight and frequently soiled bedding, meant Henry rarely got more than a few hours of rest. This sleep deprivation contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior and explosive rages. The psychological impact was devastating. Henry had always defined himself through physical dominance and presence. Now he was trapped in a body that disgusted even his closest associates, producing odors and fluids that made others recoil in horror. His eating became erratic, sometimes gorging on massive meals, other times refusing food entirely, possibly due to nausea from his infections or depression about his deteriorating condition. King Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. His death marked the end of over a decade of living decomposition. In his final weeks, the drainage from his wounds increased dramatically, and he developed what physicians called a fever of corruption, likely sepsis from his chronic infections. The smell in his final days was reportedly so overwhelming that only essential attendants could remain in his presence, working in shifts to avoid being overcome by the putrid air surrounding their dying king. Remarkably, no official autopsy was performed, unusual for a monarch. Some historians speculate that his condition was so horrific that physicians chose not to investigate further. Others suggest the state of his body made examination impractical. Even after death, Henry's body presented challenges. Contemporary accounts suggest his corpse continued producing odors and leaking fluids, complicating the embalming process. Legend holds that his coffin cracked during transport to Windsor Castle, allowing fluids to leak out. Henry VIII's case remains one of history's most horrific examples of chronic infection run wild. Modern doctors studying his symptoms believe he suffered from multiple conditions simultaneously: chronic osteomyelitis, possibly diabetes, and various complications from his massive obesity. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Henry's story is that he continued functioning as king throughout most of his medical nightmare. Despite chronic pain, embarrassing symptoms, and increasing physical limitations, he remained actively involved in governance until very near his death. The rotting king's story serves as a brutal reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot protect us from our own mortality. Henry VIII controlled religion, politics, and the lives of millions, but he couldn't control the bacteria consuming his flesh. In the end, the man who had once been England's golden prince became something far more disturbing: a living lesson in human vulnerability, ruling his kingdom while his own body decomposed around him. The smell that once filled Whitehall Palace has long since faded, but the horror of Henry's living death continues to fascinate and appall us nearly 5 centuries later.